date is April 2, 2012. My name is Paul Robards, Library Director at Roberts Memorial Library at Middle Georgia College. I will be speaking with Colonel James W. Pete Booth, retired, from Tennille, Georgia, about his experiences in the Vietnam War. Colonel Booth, you joined the military in 1952 and served until you retired in 1981. You served twice in Southeast Asia. Your first tour of duty was between 1954 through 1965. The second tour of duty occurred during the Vietnam War, which we will talk about today. If your first tour is relevant to the second, please feel free to share that also. Question 1. What branch of the military did you serve in?
Army.
Why did you join the military?
I was ROTC graduate from the University of Georgia, and in 1952 they called me to active duty.
How old were you when you joined the military?
21.
Where did you go to receive basic training?
I didn't take basic training. I was a second lieutenant, ROTC graduate, so I went to the Armor School at Fort Knox for the Company Officer course.
Okay. What was your occupation code? MOS?
1203 and 1204, and then that's tank unit leader, and 1204 is Armored Cav unit leader, and then it became 6-1204, which is Air Cavalry unit commander.
Right to that. Did you volunteer to go to Vietnam?
Yes.
How did
I'm trying
you
to remember, but I think I did. I knew I was going, and
how did you feel when you learned you were going to Vietnam once you had committed?
Well, I was a professional soldier, so I was ready to go.
Right to that. What dates did you serve in Southeast Asia?
Well, first tour was from December of 64 until December of 65. Probably about 15 December on each end. It could be 14, I don't know exactly.
Where did you serve in Southeast Asia?
3rd Corps, 3 Corps.
What was your rank during the war?
First tour was a major. Second tour was lieutenant colonel.
What awards or citations did you receive?
Silver Star with 1 oak leaf cluster. Legion of Merit with 3 oak leaf clusters. Part of the Legion of Merit, not all of them were for Vietnam service, so I guess but that was, total in the career. Distinguished Flying Cross. Purple Heart with 1 oak leaf cluster. Bronze Star. Air Medal with 23 oak leaf clusters. Offhand, that's all I can remember, but it may be 1 or 2 other. Oh, Joint Service Commendation Medal. And I think that's all for Vietnam service.
What were the circumstances of your first encounter with the enemy?
It's a long story. You want to hear that? It's part of my story.
Yes.
I'm going to tell you about my first day in combat. I went to Vietnam in a gaggle of aviators, probably about 25 or 30. And I was assigned to a staff position in MACV. If I use acronyms, you need me to explain under that. I hated that job. Could have been done by a corporal. And it had 3 captains lined up taking requests for helicopters for the next day. And they had a lieutenant colonel who arbitrated disputes. We could have done it with a captain and 3 sergeants, but anyway, that's the way it was. So I told my boss I wanted to get out of there, and so he arranged for me to be transferred to J3 short-range plans, which means panics. Short-range plans is I need it yesterday. That was better than the job scheduling, answering phones and putting down how many helicopters somebody wanted. So I stayed in there for about 4 months, something like that. And I still had to get my flying time. So once, and MACV staff, we work 7 days a week. But on a Saturday, we could get a morning off and go get our flying time. I had to have 4 hours a month, 80 hours a year, 20 hours nighttime, and all of that. So one Saturday I was flying up, flew from Saigon up to Bamatuit, turned around, coming back, just boring a hole in the sky. And I flew past War Zone D, and I looked out and there were some armored helicopters working out there. So I thought, man, I'm going to land and talk to these guys. So I went over, landed, and I was in the L-20. They call it a U-6 now, I think. So I landed and walked over to where the crews were working, rearming the helicopters, and talked to the leader and said, "Who's the leader here?" And they pointed out a captain named Dick Jarrett. So I went over, and Jarrett was a ferocious combat officer and did not tolerate fools and MACV staffers easily. So he was properly polite, but gave me what we call the RIMF treatment. You know what a RIMF is?
I classify as one technically.
Okay, so he talked and he told someone else to go show this major how the armed helicopter worked. Now, I'd already worked a lot with armed helicopters at Fort Knox. But anyway, after an hour, 30 or 45 minutes, he said, "Well, we got to go back on station," which was true. They rotated, and they cranked up the helicopter and went off. And like always, the helicopter blows sand and dirt and blows your hat off and all that. So I'm standing there, MACV staff guy, getting cascaded with sand and dirt. And needless to say, I was pissed off. One, because I didn't like being treated like a RIMP. And secondly, I didn't like being a RIMP. So I went back to my office, and I was working for General Depew, William Depew, and his executive officer was a lieutenant colonel named Wawa Phillips. So I told Wawa, I got to get out of this place. And he said, nobody's ever escaped J3 before in the whole time. And I said, well, man, I got to get out of here. So we had a talk, and it turned out that Wawa was trying to get out to the field. And so he said he wanted to prepare the way for himself. And there was one other major, a guy named Bob Stevenson, who wanted to get out. And so he said, you guys go find a job, and I'll see what I can do to the general. So I went out, and I called, I wanted to go to this armed helicopter company because it was the first one in the Army. It was the most famous one and the bedrock in the U.S. Army for armed helicopter. So I had a friend that I went through flight school who I found out was in this company. And so I called him up and said, who's commanding this company? And he said, named him Major Jim Jaggers. Well, I had known Jaggers for about an hour or two previously. At Fort Knox, myself and another gentleman named Bob Broder wrote the draft manual and the organization for Air Cavalry. And when we wrote it, it was approved for testing, and the 3rd Infantry Division at Fort Benning was testing it, and Jaggers was the company commander. So I flew down with the chief of doctrine at the armor school to see how it's going. And so when we did that, they were in the field, so we went out and met Jaggers, talked to him for an hour, maybe more, and then we left and, went to lunch with some staff officers and that kind of thing. So I said, oh, that's great. So I went over and got an appointment to go out and see Jaggers. And when I did, I went in and told him that I would like to come to this company as a company commander. He said, well, your timing may be pretty good because the Army had sent a major in here to take command of the company, and he's now over in USRV G3, but he turned it down. He didn't want to take command of the company. I don't know why. Probably connected with family. You know, maybe had a handicapped child. Could be a wire. So he said, you need to go talk to battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Bob Cunningham. So he called Cunningham and said I'd like to come up, and he said, I don't oppose it. He didn't say I endorse it. He said I don't oppose it. And I understand why he did that. You know, he don't know me, but a couple of hours at the most. So I went up and talked to Cunningham, and we talked probably 30 minutes, and the only question I remember him asking me was, what was your rank in the class at Fort Leavenworth? So I told him, and he said, that's higher than I was. I'm going to accept you. And at that time I had to reveal a problem. I was qualified in helicopters in the H-13, H-23, and H-19, but I was not qualified in the Huey. And of course this company flew Hueys, and so I told Colonel Cunningham, I'm not qualified in the Huey, I need to get qualified. He said, that's okay. He said, we'll transfer you about 10 days early. You can train and qualify, and then when you get qualified and checked out, IP signed you off, then we'll do the change of command. So that was great. So they transferred me in on the 1st of June. Up until the 9th of June, I flew an hour, 2 hours every day with the company IP. On the 9th of June, we started flying about 5 o'clock, shooting auto rotations, you know, straight ins, 180s, 360s. We probably did 10 or 12, and I didn't break the helicopter, and so my IP name was a Chief Warrant Officer, 2 or 3, named Bobby Smith, and he said, it's just getting dark, you know, dusk, and he said, okay, take it back to the ramp. I'm going to sign you off, but don't get in the right seat. In a gunship, the pilot in command flies in the right seat because the rocket sight is in front of the right seat. The co-pilot handles the machine guns. So we did and went back, and I was feeling pretty good. You know, I was ready to go, flying in the left seat, and went back and had a normal evening, had a dinner and had a beer or two and went to bed. About 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning, somebody knocked on my door, banged on it, and said, get up, Major, the shit's in the fan in Dong's Y. And I thought, sat up on the bed and said, where the hell is Dong's Y? You know? And so I proceeded to shave real quick and get dressed and went downstairs. And there was one vehicle left there. I know it's a long way around the horn, but it's part of what happened. I was able to catch that vehicle and go into Townsend. We were just outside the gate of Townsend. So caught that vehicle and we went in. I went to our operations, and it was raining, and low ceilings and all kinds of bad weather. And so a captain named Dave Scott, who had been in the company for a while, was still there. And I said, Dave, tell me what's going on. He said, he's got a bad situation up at Dong's Y, and all of our people are gone but me, and as soon as the weather clears, I'm going up to a place called Phuc Vien, which is about 15 or 20 miles south of Dong Xuai. And there was a Special Forces B team there, and they had an airstrip. And so we staged out of that airstrip. So we flew up, and I realized then that I was not checked out on the weapon system in the left seat. The machine gun system, you got circuit breakers and switches to turn them on and that kind of thing. And of course the sight. But I was familiar with machine guns. I just hadn't know how to turn the thing on and manipulate it. And so Dave went over to talk to his platoon leader, and I stayed, and the crew chief told him that I need to be checked out on this machine gun here. Of course, being a tanker, I'd fired lots of machine guns, so I knew what to do, how to shoot them, and that kind of thing. So, the Battle of Dong Xuai was an epic battle. There was Special Forces A team in there, and they had some South Vietnamese regional forces. You know what regional?
Yes, sir.
They also had a CIDG group, which was mostly Cambodians, of several hundred men, and but they were under attack, really fierce attack, by the Viet Cong 9th Division. And in the past, they had attacked lots of Special Forces outposts and things like that. They usually attacked at night, did lots of damage up until about dawn, and then they withdrew. In this case, they didn't withdraw. And they kept on attacking, and our people came back, and they were reporting 6 or 7 50 caliber 12.7 inch anti-aircraft machine guns. At that time I didn't know what that meant, but now I know what that means. It means that a regiment has a company of 3 anti-aircraft machine guns, 51s caliber 12.7. And so if there were 6 or 7 there were at least 2 regiments, which is maybe 5,000 men. Also was reported a 37 millimeter anti-aircraft cannon. That means probably there was a division there, so it looks like the whole 9th Division was there, and they were intent on overrunning the Special Forces camp, and most of the CIDG ran away. So it really came down to about 10 or 12 American Special Forces A team, plus there were some Seabees in there, probably about 20, and they were doing some construction work to build an airstrip on the road just to the west of it. So, because they weren't accustomed, the Corps commander and the Corps senior advisor were not accustomed to a large-scale attack like that, and their normal expectation was that they would pull out. The first assault helicopter company that came in was 118th, a very fine company. So they decided to commit the 1st Battalion of the 7th Arvin Regiment in there to assault the fort and get it back. There's some discussion about the LZ, where to land them. Chose what we call a new rubber field, about 2 clicks north of the fort. New rubber, the trees were 3-4 feet high, so you couldn't just land, but you could get low enough the troops could jump out. So this is my first day in combat. So the 118th landed those troops in there, and after a very few minutes they came under very severe attack. About the same time, Jaggers told Dave Scott, who I was flying with, and myself, said, you guys go up to Thinloy Rubber Plantation and do a recon of the airstrip up there. It was about 10 kilometers north. And they had an asphalt macadam airstrip. So we went up and did, and being my first day in combat, I didn't know anything. So moving there, the rubber plantation was there, the houses, the workshops, everything, but there was nobody out working, moving around, and to my knowledge, I didn't even see any dogs. That should have tipped me off immediately, but it did not. So we reconned it very carefully, several passes, and the final pass was a straight down the runway at about 20 feet at about 35 miles an hour, which is designed to tempt some guy to shoot at you, but nobody shot. So we went back and reported that to Jaggers. He was suspicious of it, and he sent Dick Jarrett, who is a very experienced and competent platoon leader and operations officer, and Jarrett reported the same thing. When Dave and I were on the way back, the portion of the 1st Battalion, 7th ARVN Regiment was under severe attack, and we were talking to the advisor on the radio, and the call sign was 2-1 Grape. And so he said, he reported we were under heavy fire. And then he said, we're in something like, we're in trouble, we got a problem here. And then we said, Dave was talking most of the time, mark your position with smoke and we'll pick you up. He said, no, not yet. And then about, 5 minutes, 10 minutes later, he came back on there and said, oh, the battalion commander's down, he'd just been killed. So we said, Dave is doing most of the talking, but I'm in the helicopter, talking to Dave on the intercom and to the door gunners. So he said, okay, mark your position with smoke, we're going to get you. So, when you're flying, you have a downwind leg, a base leg, and then you turn on the funnel. So we were on the base leg to pick him up in the field. And as we turned final, Dave said, okay, pop smoke, we're on final. And we didn't get a response. So we continued on in halfway probably and called him a couple more times, no response, so we broke off. So what happened was that entire unit was wiped out in about 30 minutes, and the advisor was Lieutenant Kurkowski, and he was killed. So then we went on back to Phu Vinh, where we were staging, and by then more assault helicopter companies had been arriving. And so by then I think they had 3 or 4, I'm not sure exactly, but 4, something like that. Those were organic to the 145th Combat Aviation Battalion, which supported all 3 corps. So we organized an assault onto the airstrip at Thinloy Rubber Plantation, where there had been 3 or 4 recons made, myself, Dick Jarrett, and a couple of other guys going up and look at it. That's a dumb thing. Don't ever send multiple guys to do that job, because that tells the VC they're coming right here. So anyway, by then they had the remainder of the 1st of the 7th on board, and they decided to, they being the ARVN 3 Corps commander and the U.S. advisor, and the 145th Battalion commander, it was kind of a command group of those people and Jaggers and some other hang-ons, and they were doing the deciding. By then, Joan Depew had arrived, the J3, because he had heard that there's a major fight going on at Dongswai, so he came up. And Dongswai was a district headquarters town, and they did not want, for political reasons, for a district headquarters town to be overrun and captured by the VC. So I got everybody on board and loaded, I'll say there's 4 assault helicopter companies, probably 70 or 80 lift ships and 25 or 30 gunships. Flew up at 1,500 feet, escorted by the gunships, and on the east side of Dongswai, and they got up to Thenloy. And the Thenloy airstrip ran generally east and west, and so they turned and were coming in. Of course, the VC saw them miles away, and as they helicopter company, the 118th again, got to the airstrip just as they were moving to the touchdown point on the western edge. A group of cows, some people say it was cows and some people say it was water buffalo, wandered out onto the runway. So they landed short of the intended touchdown point. Just as the first group of 5 or so touchdown, mortars started falling on the airstrip. One hit right on top of the 118th helicopter, blew it apart, blew it over, turned another one over. And ARVN guys jumped out, and they were all cut down within 5 or 10 minutes. So it was a very well-laid ambush set up on that airstrip, positioned in exactly the right places, and very disciplined, because nobody shot at the guys up flying around, and nobody saw anybody. So they were very disciplined. They organized that ambush the night before and had been in position there for several hours before the daylight anyway. In my book, I got a time on all these things. I think it was about 10:30 or something like that. So the battalion commander was airborne, Bob Cunningham, and when they became obvious that they were ambushed the strip, he called off the assault, and all the helicopters turned around and came back to Phuc Vin. Everybody who landed, including the advisor, a captain named Bruce Johnson, was killed there. So we went back to Phuc Vin, and try to insert here. Somewhere when Dave and I went up and made the first recon and came back and tried to pick up Lieutenant Kurkowski, we took some hits in the tail boom, and our maintenance officer was there when we landed. He looked at it and said, "Okay, you guys are grounded because you hit some spars in the tail boom, and we can't let you fly because it might break off." So at that time I told Dave, "Okay, you find us another ship. You know, we're not gonna get left out here." And so he did. And so then the next operation, I was not part of it because I was still trying helicopter to get in. But about 1 o'clock, they were monitoring the radio from a Special Forces team in Dongswai, and the call sign there was 5-5 body jab. A very brave guy. I mean, his guy stayed on the radio and in communication all day. And they monitored him, and he said, "Well, we're under serious assault Everybody in here is wounded at least once. We're down to our last few rounds of ammunition. Everybody's saving one for themselves. And so we got to pull out of this building, and there's a pit where some artillery pieces had been in there before, and they dug a pit. You know what that is. So they went to this pit, and both Jaggers and Harvey Stewart monitored that transmission. And so Harvey, one of the Teeth people say Harvey jumped up and said, "I'm going in to get them out." I'm sure that's happened, but he couldn't do that without the command group's approval and the coordination of all the gunships and the Air Force. We had FACS up there, and TAC Air was around some. And so I walked over to the command group while Dave was getting the helicopter, and basically Jaggers described that situation to them and said, we can get them out, and I think we can get 3 ships into the compound next to where they're holed up. And Harvey Stewart volunteered. He said 118th will do it. And so Jaggers said, "I'll handle the gunships and attack air." So those 3 ships went out to the east and came in, and from the southeast, and they came in low level. And when they got over the compound, they flared the helicopter, flopped it on the ground, and the Special Forces people ran out, and the Seabees, and jumped in 3 helicopters, and they took off. They probably on the ground less than 30 seconds, probably 10 or 15. Bill Fraker was flying gunship. He was the platoon leader in our company. And when the lift ships took off and they broke to the south to get over the jungle as quickly as he could, he saw 3 guys come to the door of the building waving like this, and one of them was an American. So his actions described in the book. Basically, he went back in and picked him up. A couple of things that he told me about that, and I wasn't there, but he's a very truthful guy. He said when he landed, the VC were coming over the berm, and they were running toward him, and he's sitting on the ground waiting for these 3 guys to get on the helicopter. He said it looked like the opening gun in this New York Marathon, with all the VC coming. And his co-pilot took a .45 pistol and aimed it out the window. And Bill says he was just about to tell him, don't fool with that, it's not going to be effective. And he shot, and he said he saw one VC do a flip and go down. And so he said, I didn't tell him anything, I told him to keep shooting. There was, on the top of the berm, there was about 15 or 20 yards from him, there was a VC with a BAR. And he was shooting at Bill, but he was higher than Bill on the berm, and so he never lowered the BAR to shoot in the helicopter. He shot over him all the time. So when the 3 guys got on board, he picked it up and turned it to go south over the berm, and he was losing RPM. So he bounced it on the top of the berm, picked up his RPM again, and then went off on the south side, bounced it 2 or 3 times, got his airspeed up and his RPM up. And as he went over the berm, the guy with the BAR turned and started to shoot at him from about 20 yards away. And Bill says he thought, I'm dead. But then the next instant, the VC's head went past, because the door gunner, a kid named Gene Dixon, killed him with a M60 machine gun. so they escaped. Just across the road from the compound was a soccer field, and the jungle was like this: south, west, and north. And so when I got back and landed and walked over to the command group again, the senior advisor, a guy named Jack Wilson, said, "We're going to surprise them. We're going to land in the soccer field." And I thought, "Are you nuts? Geez, you know what the hell's going on up there?" And but they said, "Okay, that's what we're going to do." So by that time, some C-123s had brought in the 52nd Ranger Battalion. And they had a U.S. Army captain and advisor. I think his name was Sullivan, but I have to go check my book. It's in the book. So the Arvin 1st Battalion of 7th Regiment had already been wiped out. So the 52nd Rangers are going to be landed right in the teeth of where all the firing was coming from. So they loaded up and took off, and by then I think we had 5 or 6 assault helicopter companies because MACV had called in a couple from other corps. I'll list all of them in the book. They went up at 1,500 feet and turned into final, and the soccer field could only accommodate a flight of 5. So they were divided into 5 and 5, 5, 5 like this, and they were probably 15 seconds apart. So we got another helicopter. Really pissed off the crew that was in there. It's a damn new company commander came up here and took my helicopter. So,
from your experience, how would you evaluate the enemy's fighting ability?
The who?
From your experience, how would you evaluate the enemy's fighting ability?
Very good. On that day, they were exceptional. They were disciplined, and they had positioned their weapons in the proper places, and they were in a very dedicated assault, and we were killing a bunch of them with helicopter gunships and TAC air, but they never backed off until that night. So we when I got a helicopter, we flew up to Phuc Vinh to join them, and we had to join the flight some way back because the early ones already had escorts. So we joined up with a flight of 5, I guess it's 12 or 15, 12 or 13 or something like that, flights of 5 back. And we turned and started to go down, and I looked down that line of helicopters. They were in perfect order, stair-stepped down. And the first group, flown by a captain named Jack Grasmetter, who flew lead in every one of the 118th assaults, by the way, was just touching down in the soccer field. And it looked like the joint, what they call JCOC, firepower demonstration at Fort Benning. You know, they bring their congressmen down, artillery and smoke grenades and flares, and everything's going off down there. That's what it looked like. So I thought, geez, you go down, you're not going to be able to survive it going down there. But, you know, that's what we do. That's our job, and that's what we do. So we went on down. We got about halfway down, and I heard a transmission that said 27's going down. And I looked in front of us on one helicopter. The 51 caliber had hit the mast, and the rotor came off. So the rotor went out like this, and the helicopter went down the jungle. I never knew if it was the aircraft commander of 27 that called, or one around him who saw it and called him down, but he was not panicked. He just said 27's going down. When we went over that point, I looked down. There was a kind of a smoking hole in the jungle. That's all there was. Everybody on that helicopter perished. we went on down, and our group landed in the soccer field, and they were probably on the ground 3 seconds, something like that, because 52nd Rangers started jumping out before they touched down. Of course, they're slowing down, and we're going at our regular speed, and so as they slow down, we go past them. So when we do, we're shooting into the jungle in front of them and to the right and to the north. As we turned to break out to the north after we had shot, we called the advisor for the 52nd Ranger Battalion. He was Black Panther 5, and said, we have some ammunition, we'll shoot for you. And he came back and said, stand by, we're in hand-to-hand combat. So we said, oh, okay. You know, it's kind of, some things are funny now, but they weren't funny then. So we flew up to the north 4 or 5 miles to kind of get out of everybody's way and stay where we didn't have mid-air collision. And after, I don't know, 15 minutes or something, he came back and said, okay, I got a target and you can shoot now. So he marked it, blew a smoke grenade and said, 50 yards to the north or something like that, and we shot it. Because we had the additional helicopters, we had enough to lift the entire Ranger Battalion in one lift. So we put them on the ground in probably less than 10 minutes. Had the whole battalion on the ground. They had enough strength, they were then able to assault the compound, the fort, and take it back. So they, in a very tough fight, and by the way, there's a quote from the After Action Report for the 2nd Company in line, 118th led, company called A of the 501st was 2nd in line. There's a report from 2 pilots in there where I extracted from the After Action Report, and they said when they landed, 4 or 5 guys jumped out on the right side and they were killed immediately. One of them was blown back into the helicopter, and 4 or 5 jumped out on the left side and they were cut down within a short period of time. So I think out of that group, maybe of 8 or 10, maybe 2 or 3 survived the landing. But they got enough people on the ground to retake the fort. So they retook it, and we did some shooting for them later in the day. And this was 10 June 65. So after dark, we flew back to Saigon and to our operational base, and went to our club where we had a mess hall and we had our dinner. So I was sitting there and kind of almost alone, because I hadn't been in the company but a few days. And all people in the company are suspicious of what we call FNGs. You know what FNG means? Fucking new guy. Because fucking new guy will get you killed because he's not seasoned. So they treat them, they stand off from them until they prove themselves in the company. And while I was sitting there, I recalled that 10 June was my son's 11th birthday, which is a common thing for a soldier. There was some more fighting going on that night, and the 9th Division withdrew, but they left stay-behind people to impede the pursuit. And so the fight went on for 2 or 3 more days, but nothing of the intensity. On that, late in the afternoon, General Westmoreland flew up to Phu Bien, and he has the authority to approve awards. So he approved 2 Congressional Medals of Honor, one for Lieutenant C.Q. Williams, who was part of the Special Forces team, and coincidentally was the oldest second lieutenant in the Army. And the other one was for a CB named Marvin Shields. Marvin Shields was killed, so his was popular. CQ was wounded, had 3 or 4 wounds, around the shoulders and the arms and legs and that kind of thing. His aide brought a note over to Bill Fraker and handed it to him. And the note said, "You were beaten out by the oldest second lieutenant in the Army." So Bill was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, which is second highest. Company commander of the 118th, Harvey Stewart, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. And 3 of the Special Forces team members, Dallas Johnson, Jim Taylor, and one other, I can't remember his name right now, awarded Distinguished Service Cross. So there were 5 Distinguished Service Crosses. And then there was a reasonable number, but a larger number of Silver Stars and Distinguished Flying Crosses awarded. I call that the Day of Heroes because, let me tell you, that was a nut-cutting fight. And so, anyway, that was my first day in combat. You want to know my first contact with the enemy was? That was it.
Do you remember seeing any action that stood out as being particularly brave?
Yeah, well, Bill Fraker's act on that day. There were lots of brave acts that day, It just, everybody was doing brave acts. A rational person would say, "I'm not going to do that because I'm going to get killed." But nobody, not one single person ever declined to do his duty, his responsibility.
What do you remember most about combat?
The courage of an American soldier.
Describe your living conditions.
That runs through 2 tours, and observing lots of American soldiers in combat in different ways. So the one thing that stands out most in my mind is how brave these guys were.
Describe your living conditions, housing, and food in Vietnam.
I'm sorry?
Describe your living conditions, housing, and food while in Vietnam.
Well, in our case, we were not infantrymen, so we had a first tour. We had a villa. The officers did right outside the gate of Thompson. It was a very nice place. We had our officers' mess in there and a bar, and we had tables with white formica on it, and there were grease pencils there, as there was the top of the bar, and it was common practice after a day to critique the battle and use grease pencils to draw it out, and everybody could comment on the battle. So they could say, "When you decided to do this, that was wrong. You should have done something else." And then the leader he needed to justify what he did in a reasonable way. We didn't have any shouting matches, anything like that. Everybody was critiquing to learn how to do this job better. So our food and our billets and that kind of thing were great. In the second tour, our troops were spread out. Had one troop at Phuc Vinh. First Cav headquarters was at Phuc Vinh, which I described earlier, but it was built up hugely to accommodate the First Cav. Our billets were adequate. We were occupied an old French fort, and so we fix those up. I put it that way. For example, we had a 55-gallon drum sitting on top and fill that with water, and the sun heated it in the day. When you got back at night, you pull a little lever and you could take a shower, and the weather kept it very comfortable for you.
What was your daily routine while in Vietnam?
Well, we were having an assault, a battalion assault. We got up about 3:30 in the morning, because usually the assault was somewhere 45 minutes, an hour away. So if we got up and had breakfast, we could get to the airfield by 4:30 or something like that, and had a chance to pre-flight the helicopter and get a briefing in operations. And then we took off at, let's say, 6 o'clock, and we would fly to the location, what we call a stage fill, and get a last-minute briefing, top off the fuel tanks, and at first light we would have the assault. And so the assault would go in, and then the gunships stayed all day long supporting the ground force. And so they would finish at, say, 7:30, 8 o'clock. Fly back to Tan Son Nhut, where our base was. This is the first tour now. When you get back, you have to go, the pilots go in and they fill out an operational report where they describe the battle and what they did and that kind of thing. And we kept those and drew lessons learned from those. The crew chiefs inspected the helicopter for combat damage and did the post-flight, reloaded with ammunition. If it had combat damage, they arranged to get it repaired so they'd be ready to go the next morning. So crew chiefs would get to the mess hall 9 o'clock, 9:30, and our mess sergeant usually saved steak sandwiches or something like that for them. And at least after I got there, you know, the first time they were served bologna, I went ballistic. Told the cooks, you guys want to stay cooks, you want to be an instrument. If you want to stay a cook, get something fit for these guys to eat. And then we got a mess sergeant, and he did it. He was a great mess sergeant. So, and then depending on how the schedule was done the next day, the crew chiefs would go through the same thing, and the pilots. We had a system. We had we call first up, second up, third up. First up was one platoon was filled all the missions. Second up probably overflowed into the second platoon, and then his other people were on what we call 5-minute standby. So they would be in operations to airfield. When they got called, they went. The third platoon, we tried to give them a day of rest. Sometimes we were successful, sometimes we were not, depending on how intense the fight was.
What did you do to relax?
Well, the first tour I was in outside, just outside of Saigon. So about every 2 or 3 weeks, something like that, I would go downtown and be out of communication with my unit. I'd tell them I'm going, and we didn't have cell phones in those days, you know. And so I'd go down to a bar and have a couple of drinks, beers, and just relax and talk to some people in the bar. For a while they had, the French had a social club out on the Saigon River they called the Club Nautique. And they did some water skiing out there. So you could go out and pay I forgot what it was, a very reasonable price, and rent the water skis for an hour or two and go water ski. But it was very popular until some sniper started shooting out, and so he was shooting at me one time. So I motioned the guy. There was a large barge or something, supply boat in the river. So I motioned to the guy driving the motorboat, ski boat, get behind the barge. And so we pulled in behind him and blocked the snipers. But nobody was ever hit out there that I know of, but it, made it a little less fun. Also, there was a club downtown called the Cercle Sportif, French club, and we were permitted to join, and you could play tennis out there, and they had a swimming pool and a whole bunch of stuff. So, and people could get in touch with you out there. So, I don't know, maybe at night sometimes the tennis courts were always lighted. So sometime at night I'd go out and play some tennis. That was about it. It was nice and relaxing, but we didn't, it was not a daily routine, put it that way.
Please tell us about any community involvement you participated in, such as irrigation or construction projects.
In the outskirts of Saigon, there's an orphanage, Catholic orphanage, and a very wonderful person, lady, called Madame Nye, ran that orphanage. The kids were 2, 3, 4 years old, and their families had been killed, or who knows what happened to them, So in the downtown, when they had probably 25 or 30 kids, and they had a farm outside of Saigon, 25 or 30 miles, where they raised produce and stuff to feed the kids in the orphanage, and they had orphans there too. I don't know exactly how many, but more than downtown. So our people adopted that orphanage, and they supported it with labor. If they had a leak in the roof, our guys got the material and got up there and fixed it. They took supplies, sheets. Army used a lot of sheets provided for that orphanage. They took food down there, and they helped that orphanage stay alive. And the little kids in there were cute as a button, but unless somebody helped them, they didn't have any future at all. You're 3 years old, your mom and daddy are gone, you don't know, unless you got somebody taking care of you, you're in trouble. So we took care of that orphanage the whole time the company was there. And there's some chapters about it in the book. One of the lieutenants wanted to adopt a kid in there. The kid was 3 years old. And he tried to adopt her and flew his wife over from the States to see this kid. It's a good picture of him with the kid holding him in the book. But he was blocked by the Vietnamese government laws of the time, at the time. That was 63, I think, 63, early 64. And the Vietnamese law said to adopt a kid, you had to have been married 7 years. Well, this lieutenant and his wife had been married 3 years. And you had to be the same religion as the kid. Who knew what this kid's religion was? She could have been Catholic, Buddhist, Wahao, lots of dialects of, not dialects, but varieties of religions, splinter groups in Vietnam. So he couldn't do it. So when I talked to him about writing a chapter for my book, by the way, 33 different people wrote chapters for the book, because when I served in 65, I knew about that period, but I didn't know much detail about before and after. So I sent out 350 letters, 350 some odd letters, to people who had served in the unit, and asked, would you write about your time in the book? Tell us what happened, what you did. 50 some odd came back and said, yeah, I'll do it. So I sent them another letter that said, okay, send me a manuscript and some pictures. 32 did that. Then I wrote my own chapter. I wrote the introduction, I wrote the epilogue, I did the glossary and the index, and put all that together.
Could you tell me about the most memorable event that occurred to you or your unit while serving in Vietnam?
Well, I think the one I remember the most is the first day, 10 June 65. I had a couple of memorable days in the first cab, several, but I think 10 June 65, which I've described extensively to you, is probably the most memorable, because it was such a huge battle, kind of an epic battle, and also because my first day in combat, I was learning a lot, and so.
What is your evaluation of American military leadership and of other commanders you worked with while in the field during the war?
Well, obviously some were better than others. Some were outstanding, just outstanding leaders and commanders. Others were pretty good. Not as good as the outstanding guys, but adequate. And there were a few cases where they were inadequate.
In hindsight, what do you believe was the reason for the war?
Well, it was political. At that time, communists, spurred on by Russia and China, seemed to be intent on taking over all of Asia. And the announced purpose of the war was to stop them in Vietnam and protect Thailand, Indonesia, and ultimately Australia from communist domination. So it was politically based, but all wars are politically based, you know that.
Did you ever feel that the American public did not support you as a veteran of the Vietnam War?
Yes.
Do you believe that Vietnam veterans encountered discrimination when they returned home from the war?
Yes.
Have your views about the war changed over the years?
No. I still have a greater admiration for the American soldier. I'm suspicious of the U.S. Congress and government. They will leave you in a heartbeat if it's politically expedient for them. And that's what happened in Vietnam. And that's likely to happen in Afghanistan. I don't know yet, but so yeah, I do not trust the politicians. Look, I think you asked a question in there. Did the Vietnamese communists beat South Vietnam, win the war with South Vietnam? And I said no. We beat the bejesus out of the Viet Cong, but when Nixon had his meltdown, the Democrats took over the Congress, and they had been out of power for a while, and they decided we're going to run this show. And they not only withdrew all support from South Vietnam, cut off the funds, cut off resupply, cut off any tactical air support, nothing. No supplies, no nothing. And Nixon was in such a weakened position, he couldn't do anything about it. So when that happened, the North Vietnamese did a massive invasion, supported by Russia and China with tanks and equipment, and the South Vietnamese army was unable to handle that based on termination of U.S. support. So they got beat. And so the media ran around with their pants on fire, talking about how we failed and got beat in Vietnam, but we didn't fail and we didn't get beat. The Congress beat us.
Would you repeat this experience if you could do it over again?
Depends on my age. You understand, for war, it takes young men because it takes lots of stamina. And us older guys may be smarter, but we don't have the stamina anymore. So you cannot lead these troops properly unless you have the stamina to stay with them.
Is there anything else that you would like the world today and future generations to know about your Vietnam experience?
Not so much about my own Vietnam experience. You know, I haven't got all the recognition that I think that I earned. But what I'd like the American people to know is there are lots of terrible stories that came out of Vietnam about atrocities and that kind of thing. We've had on several occasions civilians killed. It's very regrettable, but it was not an atrocity. Somebody, in one case, which is outlined in the book, a higher commander, leader, ordered, there was a sampan in the river with a bunch of women and kids on it, and it was in a no-fire zone, and our fire team leader didn't want to shoot at it, and he reported it, and the, what they call a company commander, that's usually an infantry battalion commander, got uptight about that and told him, I ordered you to shoot, you better do it. So he did, and lots of civilians were killed. He didn't know, nobody knows what they were doing in no fire zone, but they were in it. And, free fire zone. In a couple of other cases, we've had some civilians killed, but this is in the 9th Cav. I had the Lurks, you know what a Lurk is?
Yes, sir.
Lurks were attached to my squadron. I was an aircraft squadron commander. And we did all insertions and extractions and oversaw them. And we had a Lurk team in, and they were in a hide position off of a trail. 2-3 kilometers outside of a village. And they were hidden, you know how Lurks hide in like a covey of quail with their feet all to the inside. They were in some bushes like that, and some people who had been working in rice paddy came along, and one of them got suspicious, went over and opened the bushes and looked down at the Lurks, and they shot him, killed him. It was later determined that he was innocent, what they call an innocent civilian. At the time we opened the bushes, looked in there, they didn't know that. So Anyway, none of those are atrocities. And I deplore and despise those guys who did atrocities. But I will tell you that the commander has to set the policy and the, what I call atmosphere, the understanding in all of his soldiers that that is not permitted. Because you can't, if you leave it alone and nobody says anything to the soldier, and you get people coming in all the time, you know, you got replacements and turnovers. And one of them walks through a village and guns down somebody. He's already subject to military justice for shooting somebody. But who's responsible? If you didn't train him and tell him, then you're responsible. You don't want to send somebody for Leavenworth because you're a failure. So you have to set the right attitude and policies in the unit and make sure it's ingrained. So we didn't do any cutting off of ears, all that stuff, but we did, when the LRP team ambushed VC or NVA, our policy was, after the ambush was over, you go out and strip him down, strip the body down, everything, uniform, Ho Chi Minh sandals, everything. You leave him where he is, naked. And you take all of that material back and turn it into the G2. And the G2 folks have folks that can analyze that. They carry a little belt with rice balls in it, how many rice balls you got left, all that stuff. So the guys left naked. In one case, we had a young man who was new to the LRPs. So he was in his first ambush, and when they blew the ambush, you know, they set it up with claymores and then a fired a beating zone where all the weapons are focused on that. So when that was over, funny thing, one of the LRP people said, we always get 3 or 4 or 5 in the ambush when we blow the claymores, and then we usually get 1 or 2. We said it because we know the VC is going to run back down the trail. When he gets to the first curve in the trail, he's going to turn around and take a shot. So we wait till he gets to the curve in the trail, and when he starts to turn around, we kill him. But that's just knowing what the enemy's tactics and practices is. Anyway, go back to this kid. He went out to strip him down. It turns out that this squad that they ambushed was all girls. The VC had in 3 Corps a famous platoon that they call the Communist Women's Leadership something. You know, lots of propaganda BS. And it happened they ambushed this one squad of this group of girls. Well, this kid was a small town farm boy. He couldn't handle the fact that he had killed a woman. You know, his mama had always told him, don't hit girls, that kind of thing. So he started crying, and he fell on the ground and was throwing up, and we had to bring him out, and took lots of counseling by his leaders and the chaplain to get him straightened out. But we did not commit atrocities. We didn't cut off any ears. We didn't do any of that BS, and we certainly never tried to kill children. There's a picture in my book inside of a hooch in a village where the South Vietnamese, where the ARVN was sweeping the village. And in the picture there's a woman, looks like she's about between 25 and 30, and 3 little kids, 2 like this, and she's holding one. And in the background there's what we call a Chu Hoi Scout. You know what Chief Hoy's guy who was VC, and he surrendered, and now he's working as a scout with the Army. And I simply wrote under the picture that these 3 kids are not our enemy. And the woman is probably not our enemy. But if she picks up an AK-47 or a grenade, she's our enemy. I don't want any man of mine killed by somebody because of our inattention and because it's a woman and we think she's not going to hurt us. If a woman's armed, she will kill you. But the husband was nowhere to be seen. And the whole village that we were in, there were no 25, let's say 20 to 30, 40-year-old men. There were some old gray beard guys and some little kids like this. Everybody else was gone. They were obviously VC. They were hiding in the jungle, or they were in tunnels under the ground. I don't know where they were. The Army went through the whole village and never scared up anybody, so, I don't know. But I do know they were VC. Because there were trenches and revetments strung all the way around the village. And obviously that wasn't part of the rice farming, So, I don't know, that's a long way to answer your question, but